first time it happened, I thought I'd imagined it. A chair out of place, a lamp tilted at an odd angle. But when the couch slid across the living room on its own while I stood frozen, I knew the house was alive. And it wasn't happy. The house stood at the end of the gravel driveway, its silhouette dark against the bruised sky. It was bigger than I remembered from the photos. A Victorian relic with warped shingles and a sagging porch. A cedar block with wire rope hanging down from the windows. The door was barely half open. Chill ran through me as I stepped out of the car. The air was colder here, heavier. The realtor's keys jingled in my pocket as I approached the front door, its peeling paint barely clinging to the wood. Was the weight of it, like it had been waiting too long for someone to step inside. With a deep breath, I turned the key. The door groaned open, and the smell of damp wood and dust hit me, though reluctant to let go. The movers had already delivered the furniture. The couch sat awkwardly in the middle of the living room, the coffee table tilted as though pushed aside. I frowned, certain I had asked for a different arrangement. Setting down my bag, I noticed a draft. It was subtle at first, like a faint breath on the back of my neck. I turned sharply, but no one was there. The door had swung shut behind me, its lock clicking softly into place. I tried to shake off the unease as I unpacked a few boxes, but the feeling lingered. By the time night fell, I was too exhausted to care. I curled up on the couch, letting the hum of distant crickets lull me to sleep. It wasn't until I woke, hours later, to the sound of furniture scraping across the floor, that I realized I wasn't alone. Somewhere in the darkness, the house had started to move. I woke to the sound of scraping wood, the sharp noise cutting through the silence of the night. Hammered as I sat up, scanning the dark living room, the faint glow from the streetlight outside spilled through the window, casting jagged shadows across the walls. The couch wasn't where I left it. It had shifted just a few inches, but enough to be noticeable. The coffee table, too, angled slightly, as if pushed by something unseen. My first thought was an intruder. I grabbed the nearest object, a decorative vase, and crept through the house, the floorboards groaning under my weight. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Only silence answered. I flicked on the light, and the furniture looked normal again, perfectly in place. My mind raced. Had I imagined it? Was I still half asleep? Back into bed. The next morning, the dining chairs were wrong. Instead of being tucked neatly under the table, they were scattered across the room, one even overturned. A strange smell lingered in the air, faint but metallic, like old coins. By the third day, the house started to feel alive. The drafts grew colder, swirling around me even when the windows were shut tight. Doors creaked open on their own, the hinges groaning as if under strain. The whispers started soon after. Late at night, as I lay in bed, I'd hear faint voices, just beyond the walls. Indistinct, overlapping murmurs that grew louder the longer I listened. They came from nowhere and everywhere. The final warning came on the mirror in the bathroom. Written in the fog from my shower was a single word: leave. My stomach dropped as I realized the truth. The house wasn't just moving the furniture. It was trying to tell me something, and it wasn't a suggestion. I couldn't stay in the house without knowing what was happening. By the fourth day, the unease had festered into outright fear. I felt the house's presence everywhere. In the creak of the stairs, the way the air seemed to thrum like a heartbeat. The whispers had grown louder, distinct words barely forming, before fading back into nothingness. I started with the realtor. She was polite at first, but when I mentioned the strange occurrences, her voice stiffened. "Old houses creak," she said quickly. "They have quirks." Her tone made it clear she wouldn't say more. Desperate, I turned to the internet, digging through forums and town archives. Buried beneath articles about renovations and neighborhood events, I found an obituary. The previous owner of the house, an older man named Charles Whitaker, had died under unusual circumstances. No details were listed, but a single comment beneath the article chilled me. They say the house didn't want him anymore. That night, I drove to the town library. The librarian's expression darkened when I asked about the house. "It has a history," she said, her voice low. "But some things are better left alone." When I pressed, she handed me an old newspaper. the edges yellowed and brittle. The headline read, Astor, Astor, family vanishes from local home. The story detailed the unexplained disappearance of an entire family, a father, mother, and two children, last seen in my house. No bodies were ever found. That night, back in the house, the activity escalated. The whispers were louder, their words mocking and cruel. Furniture didn't just shift, it slammed into walls. I sat on the floor, clutching the newspaper, when I saw it, the couch dragging itself across the room, leaving deep grooves in the floor. The house wasn't haunted, it was alive, and it wanted me gone. The house was restless. Every corner felt charged, alive with something unseen. I stayed in the living room, the furniture looming like silent sentinels, watching. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic creaking coming from the upstairs hallway. I stood, my legs shaky beneath me, and grabbed a flashlight. The beam cut through the dim, highlighting, dust motes swirling in the still air. Each step up the staircase felt heavier than the last, the wood groaning, louder than it should have, as though protesting my presence. When I reached the top, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged in front of me. The hallway stretched longer than I remembered, the doors along it slightly ajar, their shadows casting eerie patterns. And the walls. Then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a figure stood, tall and motionless. It was barely more than a silhouette, but its presence filled the space, suffocating and cold. My flashlight flickered, the beam dancing erratically, before cutting out completely. "Who's there?" My voice trembled, barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head, a slow, unnatural movement, as if contemplating me. Then it stepped forward. The sound was wet, dragging, like flesh against wood. I stumbled back, the flashlight clattering to the floor. Possible angles. "Leave," it rasped, the voice layered, deep and resonant, as though spoken by a crowd. I bolted, nearly tripping over my own feet as I ran back down the stairs. Behind me, the figure didn't case, but the walls groaned, and the furniture in the living room began to shift, sliding toward the door. The house wasn't just haunted, it was trying to keep me inside. I didn't sleep. The house creaked and groaned through the night. Its sounds almost like words, though I didn't want to hear what they were saying. Were alive and watching. I had to know the truth. I returned to the library, clutching the newspaper article I'd taken earlier. The librarian gave me a knowing look, but said nothing, sliding another brittle file across the counter. "This is all we have," she murmured. Inside was a collection of faded photographs and clippings. One picture caught my attention, the original. Family standing stiffly on the front steps. A mother, a father, 2 children, all with strained, hollow expressions. A trick of the light. Beneath the photo, a handwritten note read. I swallowed hard and turned to the next clipping. It described an incident decades earlier. A child who vanished inside the house, never to be seen again. Witnesses claimed to hear him screaming through the walls long after he disappeared. My hands shook as I found the final article. It detailed the construction of the house itself. Built by a reclusive architect, it was designed with impossible angles and hidden rooms. The architect reportedly vanished inside the house before it was completed. The house consumed him, the article concluded, cryptically. The last page was blank except for one sentence, scrawled in faint ink. "It will feed on you too." I raced home, desperate to pack and leave. But as I opened the door, I froze. The furniture was back to its original positions, pristine and unmoving. The house seemed calm, until the door slammed shut behind me, and a voice whispered. I bolted for the door, but it didn't budge. My hands fumbled at the knob, twisting and pulling, but it was locked. Like the wood itself was alive, sealing me in. Behind me, the furniture began to move. Chairs, scraping. Across the floor, the couch sliding toward me with deliberate intent. "Let me out," I screamed, slamming my fists against the unyielding wood. My voice echoed back, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the house. A cold draft swirled around me, pulling at my clothes, stinging my skin. The shadows stretched, shifted, taking on grotesque forms. They slithered along the walls like living things, their shapes twisting. Had anyone been born in 1776? Would into jagged, claw-like hands. The whispering returned, louder now, overlapping voices that filled my ears until my head pounded. The words were clearer this time. Stay. Feed us. You are ours. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the edge of the coffee table, sending me sprawling. The shadows descended, their forms engulfing the room in darkness. My chest tightened, as if the air itself was being sucked out. Desperate, I remembered the matches in my pocket. With trembling hands, I struck one, the tiny flame, casting sharp light into the consuming blackness. The chandelier above me began to sway violently, its chains creaking as it threatened to fall. I crawled toward the window, shoving aside a chair that blocked my path. With one final surge of strength, I hurled the match at the heavy drapes. The fabric caught fire instantly, the flames licking upward with ferocity. The shadows screeched, their forms writhing and collapsing in on themselves. The door flew open, and I didn't hesitate. I sprinted out into the night, the cool air stinging my lungs as I gasped for breath. But as I reached the edge of the driveway, I turned back. The fire had gone out as quickly as it had started, leaving the house dark and still. And then, faintly, I saw it, the shadow in the window, watching me leave. The whisper followed me, low and guttural. You'll be back. I thought I had escaped. For weeks I stayed in a cramped motel, far from the house, the lingering smell of smoke still clinging to my clothes. Sleep came in fragments, haunted by shadows and whispers that felt too close to memory. But the nightmare was over. It had to be, until I found the chair. It was sitting in the corner of the motel room, its wooden frame familiar, the exact shade of dark, mahogany as the dining set I'd left behind. My blood ran cold. I hadn't brought it. I shoved it into the hallway, slamming the door behind me. But when I woke the next morning, the chair was back, sitting closer to the bed. Then came the coffee table. I walked into the room one evening, and there it was, its surface scratched, a faint smell of burned wood rising from it. My breath hitched as I saw the grooves in the floor, the same ones it had left in the house as it dragged itself across the room. The whispers returned that night, faint but unmistakable, seeping through the walls. And when I turned toward the mirror, I saw the reflection of the shadow behind me. It had never let me go. Share this story if you dare, but be warned. The shadow knows when its tale is told. Have you ever noticed your furniture out of place? Are you sure it wasn't trying to tell you something? I should have left it buried beneath the floorboards where it belonged. The faded diary was just an artifact. The past, or so I thought. But now, I hear her voice in the dark, her words clawing at the edges of my mind. And no matter how far I run, she follows. The attic was a place I hadn't planned to explore. The air up there felt thick, stagnant, like it had been, trapped for decades. Dust floated in beams of pale light streaming through a single cracked window. And the wooden floor creaked beneath my feet, protesting every step. I had been searching for a box of holiday decorations, but something else caught my attention. A faint, rhythmic tapping. I froze, listening. It was coming from beneath the floorboards. My heart hammered as I knelt, running my hands over the splintered wood until I found a loose plank. The tapping stopped. For a moment, I hesitated, the silence pressing against my ears. Then, with trembling fingers, I pried the board free. Beneath it was a small, dust-covered box. Its brass latch was tarnished, the edges stained with something dark that made my stomach turn. I opened it slowly, the old hinges groaning. Inside was a diary. The leather cover was cracked, the initials, E.W., barely visible on its surface. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but as I flipped through, the entries pulled me in. They began innocently enough, notes about daily life, descriptions of the weather, but as I read further, the tone shifted. The writer spoke of sleepless nights, of shadows moving where they shouldn't, of whispers that didn't belong to anyone in the house. The final entry sent a chill racing down my spine. I can hear her again. She won't stop. I've sealed her away, but it's not enough. God help whoever finds. The attic felt colder suddenly, the air heavy and electric. Behind me, the floor creaked. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Yet, as I clutched the diary to my chest, I felt it, a purring presence, watching from the shadows. The diary sat on my desk, untouched since I'd brought it down from the attic. Yet, it felt as though its presence filled the room, its weight pressing against me even when I wasn't looking at it. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, a faint tapping, just like in the attic. It was slow, deliberate, and coming from the corner of my bedroom. My breath hitched, and I gripped the blanket tighter. "Just the house settling," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder might provoke something. But then the tapping changed. It wasn't random anymore. It was a pattern. 3 slow taps, a pause, and then 2 quick ones. I turned on the lamp, bathing the room in warm light, but the sound stopped. I scanned the room, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. Everything seemed normal, until I noticed the diary. It had moved. I was certain I'd left it closed, neatly placed in the center of the desk. Now, it lay open, its pages fluttering, slightly, as if stirred by an invisible breeze. My legs felt like lead as I approached it. There, in the middle of the page, was new writing. The ink was fresh, the letters jagged and sharp. "Why did you take it?" My blood ran cold. I slammed the diary shut and shoved it into a drawer. I tried to convince myself I was, imagining things, that my exhaustion was playing tricks on me. But the tapping returned, louder this time, echoing from the walls themselves. And then, just as I was, sweet, about to scream, I heard it, a faint whisper, low and raspy, coming from directly behind me. "Put it back." When I turned, there was no one there, but the air was colder, and the shadows seemed to be waiting. I awoke to the sound of the drawer creaking open. My chest tightened as I turned toward it, the dim light from my bedside lamp barely illuminating the room, the center of the floor, its pages rippling as if invisible fingers were flipping through them. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Then the whisper returned, soft at first but growing louder, more insistent. "Why won't you listen?" I sat up, clutching the blanket as though it could shield me. My eyes darted around the room, searching. Shelley Swazi, for the source of the voice. She stood in the far corner, her form half hidden in the shadows. Her dress was tattered, the fabric clinging to her gaunt frame. Her face was obscured, but her presence was suffocating, as though examining me. "You shouldn't have taken it," she said, her voice raspy and layered, as if spoken by 1,000 mouths. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. She stepped forward, the movement slow and deliberate. Her bare feet left no sound, but the room seemed to grow colder with every step she took. "What do you want?" I managed to whisper. She stopped mere inches from the foot of my bed, her empty eyes boring into mine. Slowly, she raised her hand, skeletal fingers pointing toward the diary on the floor. "Put it back," she hissed. The lamp flickered, plunging the room into darkness. When the light returned, she was gone. The diary, however, remained open, its pages now filled with writing that hadn't been there before. My hands shook as I read the new message. "It's too late. She's awake." The house felt alive. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the walls seemed deliberate. Like the house was breathing, watching, waiting. I couldn't move without feeling her eyes on me, though I hadn't seen her since that night. The diary was back on the desk. I had tried throwing it into the basement, locking it behind the heavy door, but somehow it always returned to the same spot, open to pages I hadn't read. The whispers grew louder. They started as faint murmurs in the corners of the room, but now followed me, everywhere, rising and falling like a haunting melody. "Run. Leave. She's coming." That night, the air in the house shifted, heavy and cold. I was in the living room, staring at the diary, when the lights flickered violently, the room plunged into darkness, and I heard it, a scraping sound, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. "Who's there?" My voice cracked as I grabbed a lamp, holding it like a shield. The scraping grew louder, closer. Suddenly, the furniture began to move. The couch slid across the floor, the coffee table overturned, its glass top shattering. Then, from the darkness, her voice. You shouldn't have stayed. She emerged from the hallway, her form contorted, limbs bending unnaturally as she crawled toward me. Her face was clearer now, pale, sunken, her mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. The lamp slipped from my hands, the bulb shattering as it hit the floor. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. You can't escape her, she rasped, her voice layered and echoing. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut in front of me. The shadows closed in, her form dissolving in the darkness. And then, the diary whispered my name. The diary lay open on the floor, its pages turning as though by unseen hands. The whispers were deafening now, overlapping voices that seemed to come from every corner of the room. I backed against the wall, my breath hitching as the air grew colder. I can't do this anymore, I muttered, tears streaming down my face. Her voice cut through the cacophony. You have no choice. She materialized in the center of the room, her form barely human. Her limbs stretched unnaturally, her head tilting at an angle that made my stomach churn. Her eyes, black, endless voids, bore into mine. You took what was mine, she hissed, her voice layered with malice. Now you must pay. I didn't mean to, I screamed. I didn't. No. The diary rose from the floor, its pages flapping violently, the words glowing a sickly red. Around her writhed like living things, crawling up the walls and stretching toward me. Desperate, I lunged for the diary, my fingers closing around its tattered edges. The moment I touched it, a searing pain shot through my hand, and the room exploded in a blinding light. Put it back, she growled, her voice shaking the walls. I'll do it, I shouted. Just stop. The shadows paused, their forms trembling. She loomed over me, her face inches from mine, her breath cold and foul. You can't undo what's been done, she whispered, her grin widening. I threw the diary into the fireplace, flames consuming the brittle pages instantly. She screamed, a sound so inhuman it made my ears ring. The shadows writhed and collapsed, the air suddenly still. For a moment, I thought it was over, but then the fire went out, and her laughter echoed through the room. You'll never be free, she whispered from the darkness. The diary was gone, but the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was suffocating. The house felt emptier than before, its walls echoing with an unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. I tried to convince myself it was over, that her screams had been a final cry of defeat, but deep down I knew better. Watching, waiting. That night, I turned off the lights and climbed into bed, too exhausted to think. Sleep came in fits, broken by flashes of her face in my dreams, those hollow, staring eyes. At 3:13 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps. They weren't faint like before. They were heavy, deliberate, circling my room. My breath caught as I turned my head, expecting to see her standing in the corner. But the room was empty. And then I felt it, a cold breath against my ear. You burned it, her voice rasped. But I'm still here. The lamp flickered on its own, casting fleeting shadows across the walls. I sat up, clutching the blankets, my heart pounding. The shadows shifted, pooling together in the center of the room, forming her shape. She was smaller now, less human, her figure distorted and broken. You can't get rid of me, she whispered, her grin widening. You brought me back. I'll never leave. The shadows swirled around her, then dispersed, leaving me alone in the dim light. I haven't seen her since, but the house hasn't let me forget. Objects still move on their own. The whispers return at night, and in the mirror, just behind my reflection, I sometimes catch the faintest glimpse of her. Smile. She's not gone. She never will be. If you found her diary, would you open it? Share this story, but be warned. Some pages were meant to stay closed forever. Can you feel the weight of her eyes on you, or is that just your imagination playing tricks? It was supposed to be just a dare, a stupid game to pass the time. And if the stories are true, he'll answer. But I didn't just hear a response. I felt him. And now, no matter. Where I go, he follows. The church stood at the edge of town, dark and crumbling, its outline sharp against the night sky. The air felt strange, heavy, almost like the building was alive. Deep down, I knew we shouldn't be here. Ben, always the troublemaker, handed me the flashlight with a grin. Heh, just say his name. What's the worst that could happen? I hesitated, looking at the ruined church. Everyone knew the stories. A pastor who lost his mind, a congregation that disappeared, and a curse tied to his name. Come on, it's just a name, Sarah added, but she sounded nervous. I swallowed hard, gripping the flashlight as my hands shook. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, the church was cold and dark. Broken pews were scattered across the floor, and cobwebs covered the altar. The air smelled damp and rotten. Standing in the middle of the aisle, I shivered. My voice shook as I whispered, "Pastor Isaac, Pastor Isaac, Pastor Isaac." For a moment, nothing happened. The room stayed silent. Too silent. Then I heard a low groan, like the building itself was moving. Wood cracked somewhere in the dark. A flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. I spun around, heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" I called out, but the room only echoed my voice. Then in the corner, I saw something. A figure. It blended with the shadows, but it was there, watching. "Welcome," a deep, broken voice rasped, sending a cold chill through me. The flashlight went out, and the darkness swallowed me whole. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows shifting in the church. Heard that voice, broken, raspy, and inhuman. Even when the sun rose, the memory clung to me like a second skin. But it wasn't just in my head. Strange things began happening almost immediately. The first was the tapping. It started softly, a faint knock, knock, knock on my bedroom window. At first, I thought it was just the wind. There was no one outside. That afternoon, I noticed scratches on my bedroom door, 3 long, jagged marks that hadn't been there before. My stomach churned as I ran my fingers over them. They felt fresh, as if something or someone had been clawing to get in. The worst came later, when I was alone in the house. I was in the kitchen, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. "Hello?" My voice wavered as I called out. I knew no one was home. The footsteps stopped. Then came a soft creak, like someone pressing down on the top step of the staircase. My chest tightened. I grabbed a knife from the counter, gripping it so hard my knuckles ached. "Who's there?" I demanded, but the only answer was silence. And then, just as I'd thought I'd imagined it, the light above me flickered. A single word, whispered through the air so close it felt like it was spoken directly into my ear. "Welcome." I bolted from the house, but as I slammed the door shut, I felt the icy touch of fingers brushing my shoulder. I barely made it through the night. Every sound felt amplified, the creak of the walls, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint whistle of wind outside. But worse than the sounds were the shadows. They didn't stay where they should. They shifted and moved, flickering just outside my vision. The next morning I convinced myself it was all in my head. Exhaustion, I thought. Too much stress. But then I saw the message. Scratched into the surface of my bathroom mirror were 2 words. "You're mine." I stumbled back, my pulse hammering in my ears. The words were jagged and deep, the edges of the glass splintered. That night it got worse. I was lying in bed, trying to focus on my breathing, when the tapping started. Again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from the closet. I sat up, every muscle in my body tensed. The tapping turned into scratching, slow and deliberate. Breath caught in my throat as the closet door creaked open. Just an inch, but enough to see darkness. Beyond it, an unnatural, suffocating blackness. Then came the voice, low and guttural. "You called me. Why are you running?" I froze, too terrified to move, but the door swung open further. A shadow stretched out, unnaturally long and thin, reaching toward the foot of my bed. I screamed and bolted for the light switch. When the bulb flickered on, the shadow was gone. The closet door was closed, but the scratches on the inside of the door told a different story. Deep, fresh marks, that spelled one word: stay. I knew then I couldn't escape him. Not anymore. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. The shadows seemed to stretch toward me, and the whispers never stopped. Their low, rasping voices echoing in my ears, even when I covered them. I felt like I was suffocating. I fled to the library, desperate for answers. The fluorescent lights felt harsh, but they were comforting in their artificial normalcy. I buried myself in the local archives, searching for anything about Pastor Isaac and the church. My fingers trembled as I flipped through brittle newspapers and faded records. The stories were worse than I imagined. Pastor Isaac had once been revered, but something had changed. Parishioners reported strange sermons filled with fire and brimstone. Entire families gone without a trace. Witnesses claimed to hear screams from the church late at night. The town eventually sealed it off, branding it cursed ground. As I read, a chill crept over me. The fluorescent lights above flickered. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision. "Come back to me," a voice rasped. I spun around, heart racing, but the library was empty, or so I thought. On the table behind me, a book lay open, though I hadn't touched it. Phrase scrawled in jagged letters. "You shouldn't have called me." My hands shook as I slammed the book shut. I grabbed my bag, ready to leave, but as I turned the door, the library creaked open on its own. Beyond it, the hallway stretched into shadows darker than they should have been. "Find me," the voice whispered again, closer this time. I backed away, but I knew there was no escape. Wherever I went, he would follow. The church door creaked as I stepped inside, the sound echoing through the cavernous darkness. My heart raced, and my flashlight trembled in my hand. The air was heavy and cold, carrying the faint scent of decay. "I'm here," I called out, my voice cracking. The silence that followed was oppressive, wrapping around me like a noose. Then, from the far corner of the room, came the sound of scraping wood against stone. Slowly, agonizingly, a shadowy figure emerged from the gloom. His form was twisted, grotesque, the remnants of his burned features illuminated by the weak beam of my flashlight. "Why did you summon me?" Pastor Isaac hissed, his voice guttural and wet, like each word was clawing its way out of his throat. "I didn't mean to," I whispered, taking a step back. "You spoke my name," he growled, his hollow eyes boring into mine. "You brought me back." The pews rattled violently as he advanced. The flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, he was suddenly inches from my face. His breath was icy, his smile jagged and wrong. "You can't leave," he said, his voice a whisper in my ear. "You belong to me now." I stumbled backward, tripping over a broken plank, and fell to the floor. His laughter filled the space, reverberating like a chorus of demons. Desperate, I screamed, "What do you want from me?" He loomed over me, his shadow stretching impossibly long. "Your soul," he rasped. The flashlight shattered in my hand, plunging the room into total darkness, but I could still feel him, his icy presence crawling closer, consuming everything. And then there was nothing but the sound of my own screams. The days after the confrontation blurred together, but the fear never left. I moved out of the house and then stayed with a friend, thinking I could escape him. But Pastor Isaac wasn't bound by walls. Wherever I went, he followed. It began with the mirrors. At first I thought it was paranoia, catching glimpses of him in the corner of my eye, his disfigured face, his hollow, burning eyes. But then, one night, as I brushed my teeth, he appeared fully. His figure filled the glass, grinning as if mocking my terror. When I spun around, the room was empty. "Did you think you could leave me?" His voice echoed later, when I sat in the safety of a bright cafe. The people around me didn't react. I froze, staring at my untouched coffee. As the napkin before me shifted, the words, "Still mine," scrawled across it, in dripping red. The shadows in my room at night grew longer, darker. No amount of light could chase them away. The bed would creak under an invisible weight. A cold breath would brush my neck. And always, his voice. "You called me. You belong to me." I stopped sleeping, too afraid to close my eyes. But exhaustion finally won. When I woke, my skin burned, and there, on my arm, were claw marks. 3 deep gashes. I'd tried to destroy anything connected to the church. The flashlight, my notes, even my clothes from that night. But it didn't matter. He was inside me now, tethered to my very existence. One night, as I sat in the dark trembling, I whispered into the emptiness, "What do you want?" The room turned icy. His voice surrounded me, soft and cruel, forever. And in that moment I realized there was no escape. He would never let me go. If you dare, share this story. But remember, saying his name, even once, might be enough to call him. Are you brave enough to whisper his name in the dark? Or will you hear his footsteps before you? Song even speak?